Hello and welcome everybody to today's webinar on recovery-oriented practice and immigrant and refugee populations. My name is Benita Varga and I'm a knowledge broker with the Mental Health Commission of Canada. Today we're joined by two great speakers to talk with us in depth about their respective research and programs. But just before we get started, I'd like to go through a couple of housekeeping items. I'd like to invite you to send any questions or comments using the chat feature, which can be found on the right-hand side of your screen. If you can't see the chat box, look for the icon on the upper right-hand corner of your screen. It says chat and it looks like a little bubble. So click on that and then a chat window should appear for you on the right-hand side of the PowerPoint slides. We encourage you when you're sending your questions for the presenters to please use the drop-down menu and make sure that you've selected all panelists so that questions go to myself as well as the presenter. And what will happen is I will facilitate a Q&A on everybody's behalf at the end of the webinar. So this webinar is also being recorded and it will be posted on the MHCC website in the webinar archive section following the presentation. It usually takes about 2 weeks. We will also be posting the slides from today's webinar in both French and English. Due to the large number of participants today, we've also muted your phone lines on entry just to eliminate any background noise. So our webinar series is meant as an introduction to the guidelines for recovery-oriented practice, which were released in June of 2015. The guidelines were developed through extensive consultation, and they attempt to take the concept of recovery and provide a comprehensive review of what it means to apply a recovery orientation in practice or by an organization. The guidelines look at 6 key dimensions and overarching themes. So if you're interested, you can go back into our webinar archive and visit the first 7 webinars that we did, which take a look at the entire guidelines document chapter by chapter, and that includes an in-depth introduction to the concept of recovery. For our upcoming webinars, including today, we've actually reviewed feedback and comments from our post-webinar evaluations and are looking for ways to meet people's requests. So we've had a number of folks indicate that they have interest in this topic and in our future topics, so that's how we are determining our presentations. So today's presentation is designed to take a deeper dive into information contained in Guideline 4C, which is about responding to the needs of immigrants, refugees, ethnocultural, and racialized populations. And before I turn it over to our presenters, I'd like to just take a moment to talk about some of the foundational research that the MHCC has completed to support the improvement of mental health services for immigrant, refugee, ethnocultural, and racialized populations. And what you see on the slide is just sort of a progression of a number of our research papers. And so beginning in 2008, MHCC created a diversity task group to consider mental health topics and challenges specific to Canada's diverse populations. What we found originally is that we really needed to find ways to reflect the very diverse demographics in Canada. And by that, you know, if we really consider that about 1 in 5 or 20% of people living in Canada were born outside of Canada, that's a really large portion of the folks that we're trying to serve. And I think in some places, and I'll use Ottawa as an example because that's where we're located, we've just found that 48% of people living in Ottawa are either immigrants or the children of immigrants. So we're talking about close to half of our population is, I think, really understanding what it is to migrate, what it is to sort of be very potentially global citizens. So I guess all of this is to say that the Diversity Task Group in 2008 wrote a really great report called Issues and Options for Service Improvement, which actually fed up into the mental health strategy. And it's the mental health strategy that called for the need to create guidelines for recovery-oriented practice, where we see a guideline on this. And I think more recently, in light of Canada's commitment to resettle refugees, we've written a briefing note and a backgrounder on ways to support the mental health of refugees. And most recently, just last October, we released a report called Building the Case for Diversity. So that Issues and Options report that was released in 2009 actually looks at some of the systemic approaches to health equity and how we improve access to mental health services for diverse populations. So that report made 16 recommendations for service improvement that rest on 3 pillars. And those pillars are up on the screen, and they're better coordination of policy knowledge and accountability, the involvement of communities, families, and people with lived experience, which I think is very much in line with recovery-oriented practice and the importance of including lived experience in all of our program design, monitoring, and evaluation. And it also talks about more appropriate and improved services. And so just to touch on, before we hand it over to our presenters, the most recent piece of research that the Mental Health Commission has been involved in, it's called the Case for Diversity, and it was really designed to consider the benefits of investing in culturally and linguistically appropriate mental health services, and ultimately in creating a more equitable mental health service for everybody. And that research did an up-to-date lit review. It did a scan of promising practices that are currently taking place in Canada. It consisted of a number of regional consultations, and it also did a data and economic analysis. And what that data and economic analysis uncovered is that we do see major spending disparities. So the research looked at citizenship and immigration data, and it compared it to OHIP data in the province of Ontario, and what we found was that we spend about half as much money on the mental health of immigrants if you look at it, per person, per cost. And so there are still some major disparities and some inequities that are happening. And just about 3 weeks ago, the Commission hosted a national action table on improving mental health service planning for immigrant, refugee, ethnocultural, and racialized populations to start to address this gap and to consider how we actually better sort of plan ahead, and rather than being reactionary, but being proactive. And so over the course of the next 2 years, the Mental Health Commission is putting together an action plan to focus on the evaluation and consideration of promising practices that have the potential to be scaled, as well as building a toolkit that will become available from presentations made at the action table. So those things will all be forthcoming over the course of the next 2 years. And with that, I would like to now introduce our 2 presenters for today. And so first, we have Dr. Rob Whitley, who's the principal investigator for the Social Psychiatry Research and Interest Group, also known as SPRING, at the Douglas Hospital Research Center. He's also an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry at McGill University. His 3 main research interests are recovery, stigma, and men's mental health. He takes a human rights approach to his activities, using his research results to push for change in practice and policy. He has published over 100 papers in the field of social psychiatry and currently writes a monthly column for the Huffington Post and Psychology Today. So we're really pleased to have Rob here with us. Our second presenter is Janet McAllister. Janet's an equity and engagement lead who's worked with the Center for Addiction and Mental Health for over 22 years in a variety of roles over the years. Those roles have included health equity and engagement, alcohol, tobacco, and drug policy, and at the local, provincial, and/or national levels. She's based out of London, Ontario, as part of CAMH's Provincial System Support Program. Her current health equity work includes several projects focused on refugees and immigrants, their mental health and addiction support, social determinants of health, and access to interpretation. Her other work includes providing health equity support for the area mental health and addiction system and its service providers. And I think with that, I'd just like to add that while we talk about recovery-oriented practice, recovery is very much rooted in concepts of human rights, an area of interest for Dr. Whitley, as well as health equity, which is an area of focus for Janet. And so while we know that the guidelines are there to help support the implementation of recovery-oriented practice, I think we acknowledge that it's not necessarily exhaustive and that we can look to other fields and other areas to provide us with additional information. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Rob to begin his presentation. So let's all welcome Rob.
Thank you very much, Bonita. Merci beaucoup, bonjour à tous. je vous souhaite la bienvenue. Je vais parler en anglais, mais vous êtes bienvenue à poser des questions en français ou vous pouvez m'envoyer un courriel en français. Thank you, Bonita. I've just said I'm going to speak in English, but you're welcome to ask questions in French or send me an email in French. So what I wanted to do today was to talk about recovery amongst immigrants. And what I'm really going to do is spend a brief amount of time in the introduction just talking about what recovery is. Bonita's assured me that many people on this phone are very familiar with the concept of recovery, so I won't spend too much time talking about the concept, but I'm really going to talk mostly about two studies that I conducted where we kind of systematically examined recovery amongst immigrants. One of them was a statistical epidemiological study where we followed up over 2,000 people, and the other one is a more in-depth qualitative study where we looked at immigrants and compared them to non-immigrants regarding their definitions of recovery and their facilitators and barriers. So just to start off, many of you will be aware that in 1993, a professor at Boston University named Bill Anthony wrote a paper about recovery, which has become a seminal paper and really started the whole recovery movement. The consumer survivor movement, people with mental illness, progressive clinicians and researchers really embraced this concept of recovery and promoted this concept of recovery. And as many of you will know on this line, recovery, as it's been redefined, is not really the same as how it's been used clinically up till the 1990s. So in the clinical world, the concept of recovery used to mean symptom remission, whereas now it means more like having a full life, living your life to your full potential, doing the things in the regular world, everyday things which everyday people without mental illness can expect to do. For example, having a job, having a life, having social connections, being integrated into the community, etc. Governments around the world, especially the English-speaking world, so in Australia, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, Canada, have embraced the notion of recovery in mental health policy and mental health action plans. So if you look at the national mental health action plans in Australia, in the UK, in the US, they all say that recovery must be a underlying foundation for everything that's done in mental health services. This is also the case in Canada. So many of you will know that the Mental Health Commission of Canada was created in the year 2007. And up to that time, Canada was the only country in the G8 that did not have a national mental health strategy. So one of the tasks which the Mental Health Commission of Canada undertook was to create a mental health strategy, and they produced a kind of working document in 2009, and this in 2012 they then actually produced the actual strategy. And I put two quotations in there just to show how people with how the Mental Health Commission of Canada have really embraced this notion, and how the Minister of Health and various provinces have also talked about recovery, and provincial governments have embraced the notion. The definition given by the Mental Health Commission of Canada is recovery involves a process of growth and transformation as a person moves beyond the acute distress often associated with a mental health problem or illness and develops newfound strengths and ways of being. So you can see there it's a focus on strengths and a focus on new skills. The Mental Health Commission of Canada in 2012 said, mental health service providers must work with users of the system to examine what changes are needed. So really a focus on recovery in these Mental Health Commission of Canada documents. And as said, the kind of, as we define recovery now, it talks about, as I said, kind of having everyday things, not focusing on symptom remission, but focusing on things like community integration, social engagement, employment, housing, social relationships, romantic relationships, etc. So really social factors more than, say, biological factors or psychological factors. So that's kind of my brief introduction. I'm now going to make a transition into study of immigrants. As it says in the Mental Health Strategy, which was produced in 2012, there was a whole chapter devoted to the subject of immigrants, that immigrants face significant barriers to their seeking or obtaining help. health organizations need to be attuned to differences and take into account cultural diversity. So the mental health strategy really puts out a forceful call for health organizations to examine differences, attune themselves to them, and have programs which take account of cultural diversity. As Bonita said in the introduction, around 20% of people in Canada are immigrants, like myself, and in cities like Toronto and Vancouver, that moves up to more like 40%. So it's it's becoming a pressing issue. So I'm primarily a researcher at McGill University and the Douglas Hospital. So in that role, I conduct research studies. And I recently brought 2 large research studies to a close, which I really want to spend the rest of my presentation talking about. And these research studies were propelled by certain research questions, which I listed there. So the first question was, do immigrants have higher or lower rates of mental illness in comparison to the Euro-Canadian population? That question is actually a very important question that we're not really sure of the precise answer, because some studies show that immigrants have lower rates and some studies show that they have higher rates and some studies show they have the same. So in my next slides, I'll talk about my own study. Second question is, do immigrants have higher or lower rates of service utilization? So if they have an emotional problem or mental illness, are they more or less likely to go to a mental health service provider? The third question is, do they have different definitions of recovery? So the Bill Anthony paper in the 1990s was the classic paper on recovery, and since then there's been some redefinitions, but it's generally a consensus in the literature about that the Bill Anthony definition is a good definition, but do immigrants in my study have different definitions? And the final research question was, do immigrants have different self-defined barriers or facilitators towards recovery? And underlying all these 4 questions is not only the kind of facts, we're trying to elicit the facts, but also the kind of why question. If it turns out immigrants have higher rates or if they have lower rates of service utilization, we're very interested in knowing why. And as said earlier, I did 2 studies. One was a more kind of quantitative, epidemiological, numeric study, and the other was a more kind of qualitative, in-depth, kind of getting to know people at a face-to-face level study. And this allows us to answer these questions in a more comprehensive manner. So first off, and some people might find this somewhat surprising, is that when we had 2,000 people in a study and approximately 20% of them were immigrants, and we compared the immigrants, this was done in the neighborhood of Verdun in southwest Montreal, so quite a poor kind of neighborhood, working class neighborhood, with a lot of immigrants and a lot of kind of working class French Canadians. We found that immigrants actually, when we compared overall, had better mental health than non-immigrants. So immigrants had lower rates of psychological distress, they had lower rates of depression, they had lower rates of alcohol problems, they had higher rates of well-being, and higher rates of what we could call, I guess, social satisfaction, satisfaction with their personal relationships, satisfaction with their daily life. And I can send a link, maybe when I'm off air in the chat box, I'll send a link to the paper which I published, which summarizes these results. Some people might find these surprising, but one of our hypotheses, after we did the numeric research and we did more qualitative studies, what we found was that immigrants tended to have kind of closer knit families, that they came to Canada in a family unit and they put a lot of their effort and their investment time-wise into their family. They had more social support, less anonymity. The immigrants often were enmeshed more in their own ethnic community, that they were involved in kind of community associations, and this gave them a level of psychological resilience and resistance. And thirdly, which I'll talk about later on in 5 minutes or so, a key factor was religion and spirituality, that immigrants reported being involved in churches or in mosques or in other religious communities. And even if they weren't, they talked about having a kind of almost a personal relationship with God, that they prayed, that they did things in other religious, listened to the radio, sermons on the radio, read the Bible, read sacred text, etc. So the importance of spirituality and religion really seemed to come through in our study. So that's the kind of numeric study, or one element of our numeric epidemiological study. The second one, and again, this might be surprising to some people, health service utilization. Immigrants had lower rates of health service utilization in comparison to people born in Canada. That finding repeated a finding that other researchers across Canada have found before me, that immigrants are much less likely to actually go to a formal healthcare provider, such as a psychologist, a psychiatrist, a social worker. And actually, instead, if they do have an emotional problem, they're more likely to go and see a priest or some kind of spiritual healer or an elder from their own community, or kind of manage it within the family or within their own community. So that's well known. Some people have hypothesized that one of the causal factors for this lower utilization is that they are unhappy with health services, that they feel that doctors and psychologists and social workers don't understand their culture, maybe even might be somewhat racist or culturally insensitive, shall we say. However, in this study, one thing we did, which many other researchers have not done, is we actually measured the level of satisfaction that immigrants felt when they did interact with a doctor or psychologist or psychiatrist or a social worker on a scale of 1 to 10. And we also measured the same for Euro-Canadians, so basically white Canadian-born people. And surprisingly, what we found was that immigrants actually had higher rates of satisfaction than those people born in Canada. And we compared, so that these immigrants came from all over the world, basically, mostly from Asia and Africa, but also a sizable number from South America, some from Europe, United States, and some from Australia and places. But we broke it down between the 5 continents, one could say, and we found that immigrants from Asia and Africa were actually especially satisfied with services compared to the Canadian-born. This is somewhat perplexing result for us in some ways. Basically, the people whose culture, one could say, deviates most from a traditional Canadian culture were more satisfied. We can maybe talk, if we have time, we can talk about that in the discussion, but I'll just leave it out there. And as I said, I'll send a link to my paper in the chat box when I've finished. One of the questions that we asked in the more kind of qualitative study was, what are the definitions of recovery? So we would talk to immigrants and talk to non-immigrants, or people in my research team did most of the hard work, and ask simple questions. So an immigrant with schizophrenia, a non-immigrant with schizophrenia, ask them, what does recovery mean to you? What is your definition of recovery? And what we actually found is that these were very similar between immigrants and non-immigrants, that they would talk about things like autonomy, being able to make their own decisions in life, being independent, not being reliant on healthcare, on the state. So, for example, having a job, being employed, having a girlfriend or boyfriend. An answer we constantly got was, we'd say to people, what does recovery mean to you? And to kind of pass it down to a simple sentence, people would say, I'd like to have a girlfriend, and I'd like to have a job, and I'd like to have a cell phone. Kind of people would repeat those 3 things, regardless of whether they were immigrants or non-immigrants. Housing was a common theme between immigrants and non-immigrants. So some of the people in our studies lived in kind of halfway houses, or lived in a bedroom in a house with a lot of other people, family or non-family, and said having a place that they could call their own with a door and a key was very important. That was part of recovery for them. Social engagement, being more socially engaged in the community. So they were really the main factors, and we did a real systematic comparison between immigrants, non-immigrants. I did it. One of my postdoctoral students did it. We got graduate students, and none of us could find any significant difference in these definitions of recovery. So, I mean, the kind of underlying message, I know a lot of people here on the line of service providers, was that we really felt that if you just use the traditional definitions of recovery with immigrants, that you'd be talking their kind of language and would be meeting their needs. And in terms of barriers to recovery, we found 2 or 3 barriers, and significant barriers towards recovery. We asked similar questions to immigrants, non-immigrants. What are the barriers that you experience towards recovery? What are impediments? What's getting in your way? What would help overcome these barriers? And the one thing that stuck out like a sore thumb was stigma. So both immigrants and non-immigrants alike talked about stigma as a very serious barrier to recovery. People talked about stigma that they've internalized as a consequence of constantly being told that they're incapable, people saying you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that, and then kind of external stigma. So people said they would go to job interviews and they wouldn't be given a job offer because people discovered they had a mental illness, or somehow they learned from their address that they were living in a group home or whatever. People talked about stigma in social relationships, in dating, that they were trying to make friends and people would learn they had a mental illness and suddenly these friends would dissipate. Again, this was, I mean, one could say in a way this is somewhat surprising. There's been a lot of literature which says that stigma is much higher in immigrant communities. From my study and from, well, one could say that that's actually a stigmatizing perspective to actually assume that stigma is higher in immigrant communities. We did not find that in this study. We found it was very similar if you're French-Canadian, Anglo-Canadian, or if you're an immigrant from the Caribbean or from Africa or Asia, that there's a lot of stigma from your friends, family, society, regardless of your ethnic origin. The other factor which I didn't put in my slide there was financial strain. So that was another common barrier to recovery. So basically poverty, not having money. People would say simple things like, my brother lives on the other side of town. I would love to go and see him. That's really helps in my healing process, but I literally can't afford the bus fare to go across town and get back again. People would say that they would like to apply for jobs online, but they don't have money to buy a computer to live or have internet at home. So I didn't put that in my slide there, but financial strain was the second biggest barrier. That stigma, as I said, was number one. That's really a topic for another presentation. And I think this is my last slide. I said I would try and keep it to 30 minutes and trying to succeed. What were the facilitators to recovery and how did these differ between immigrants and non-immigrants? So again, we found facilitators were very similar between immigrants and non-immigrants. So people said having some level of employment was very important for recovery, having some level of social integration, whether it was with family, friends, even more kind of casual acquaintances, going to the library, taking an adult education class, just going to sit in the park and feeling part of society, people said was something that helped facilitate their recovery. Being out in nature. Again, we found similar facilitators between immigrants and non-immigrants. There was one exception which I would like to talk about before I finish the presentation, and that was, which I talked about 10 minutes ago, the role of religion and spirituality. This was the one thing which immigrants talked about much more frequently and with much more depth and passion than non-immigrants. So people in the immigrant population would say they prayed regularly, they attended a place of worship, they consulted sacred texts, and that this really was a causative factor in their healing and recovery. And they would talk about, as I said earlier, about God, having a kind of personal relationship with God, that this was an important factor for their healing. A lot of the interviews were done in people's homes, and we would go to their home to do the interview. And they would show us Bibles, Korans, they would crosses on the wall. People would bring books out, commentaries on the Bible or magazines, etc. And it was really a huge part of their life, clearly, from both what they said and from what we could observe when we went to their home. And probably a good way to end this is just from other research that I've done. There's been psychiatry has been criticized by many people for not incorporating religion or spirituality into its practice, especially recently. So when psychiatry was founded 100 years ago, it had kind of one leg in the humanities and one leg in science. So if you look at people like Carl Jung or Carl Jaspers and the founders of psychiatry, many of them saw a great role for religion and spirituality in helping in the recovery of people with mental illness and helping in the healing. Many of the original mental hospitals were founded by people from religious backgrounds. So Douglas Hospital, where I work, used to actually be called the Verdun Protestant Hospital, and Louis H. Lafontaine Hospital in the East End of Montreal was a kind of Catholic hospital. And what's happened in the evolution of psychiatry is it evolved into a discipline where we had what we call a biopsychosocial model, where there was an equal emphasis on the biological, the psychological, and the social. In the last 20 years, a lot of people, including me, have said that it's evolved into what we call a bio model, biological model. And there's not much room or incorporation of things like religion and spirituality into everyday psychiatric practice. The Douglas Hospital, where I work, has a chaplain who's very busy and but has a kind of minor role in the hospital operations. And we just find when we do research that psychologists and psychiatrists are uncomfortable and sometimes reluctant to incorporate any kind of religious or spiritual healing into their practice. And I guess when you finish doing a research study, some people say, like, what should we do differently in future? One thing I would say that comes out of our research is that working with immigrants, it would be really helpful if somehow religion and spirituality could be incorporated into the healing process, into the actual place where people come, maybe involving spiritual healers. There's a whole literature out there about how to do this well, which has been kind of evaluated, and how to do it systematically, so you're not, one thing we don't want to do is impose religion or spirituality onto people, and we don't want psychologists to pretend they're spiritual healers, but there's a whole community of people out there who can work as therapeutic allies in the therapeutic relationship. So I think that's really the main point I would like to end on. I have published other papers in the past about I've published a paper called Religious Competence as Cultural Competence, which I'll put in the chat box, where I give advice about how to incorporate kind of religion and spirituality into the healing process for immigrants and non-immigrants alike, in a sensitive manner, as I said, which doesn't impose your worldview or religion onto people, but kind of works with it as a natural ally. As said, I'm going to hand the mic over to Janet very shortly, but that's my email. People can email me anything, questions, and I'm going to be on the line until 2:30 anyway, so if anyone has any other questions, I'll be happy to answer them. So thank you, everybody, and over to you, I guess, Janet or Bonita.
Thank you. Bonita, my computer froze, so I'm just wondering if you would be able to move the slides on for me.
Absolutely, Janet. We're very happy to do that for you.
Thank you. It just happened about 3 minutes ago, so it's been a little bit exciting. So thank you very much for having me here today. And I just want to tell you a little bit about the Seeds of Change project. It's a story in itself, and as I finish the story, then I'll tie it into the recovery-oriented practice document and the guidelines for it. So to start off with, we'll cover the history, the engagement process, which is really important to this project, the strategic plan, products and results, and some good practices related to that. I have been involved with the Seeds of Change project, which has focused on informal and formal support for refugees and immigrants since its inception, which was about 5 years ago. We've had some breaks during that 5 years, but that's when it started. So I work for the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, but I'm also chair of a working group in our community called Networking for an Inclusive Community, and also for the Seeds of Change. The NIC group focuses primarily on providing networking opportunities for people working with refugees and immigrants, and also education and awareness opportunities for them. So the Seeds of Change project started as a partnership between NIC, the London Middlesex Local Immigration Partnership, so we're on the 4th slide now, Benita, Local Immigration Partnership, and a war trauma group, which folded into the Seeds of Change project once it got started. We developed a steering committee that was made up of a variety of representatives from our service community, and within that committee we also had professionals who have lived experience in terms of being a refugee or immigrant. On to the next slide. One of the big pieces or foundation parts of the foundation for this project was to engage people throughout. So we included service providers, from mental health and addiction workers to police to the library to refugees and immigrants throughout the project to make sure that we were on track with what we were doing. Our initial thought was that we would develop informal and formal supports for the refugees and immigrants, and then also help the mental health and addiction organizations service the refugees and immigrants in a better way, or help them increase their comfort level with servicing that group. What we found out was that our plan wasn't quite right, and I'll go into that in a minute in terms of what we had to do to change things. So the involvement of all those groups has played a really valuable role in terms of what we've done. We've always seen this as a pilot, and that anything that we've learned or developed that we would make available to other communities, and also in a way that they can adapt it to their own community needs. Because we do recognize that what may fit into the round hole here may end up not fitting into a round hole in another place. That one size does not always fit all, and so we've tried to create things that can be adapted by different communities that may end up using these products and the model. So on to the next slide with regards to engagement. I can't emphasize enough how much this was important to the project. And we initially started the project by meeting with cultural and faith leaders and leads within the service provider community to try and get them on board, try and understand what their issues were, and try and make sure that we incorporated those issues into the project plan. We had also understood from our steering committee that if we didn't get some of the cultural or faith leaders on board, that because they provide guidance to their community, that we may not end up engaging with those communities because the leader may not support. If the leader didn't support the project, they just wouldn't show up. So it was really important for us to have a meeting with them and to get their input. What was pretty amazing about that meeting was that they actually got to sit down together and learn that some of the issues that they were dealing with were also happening within other faith groups, within other cultural groups, and even it was amazing for some to learn that a lot of their issues, such as stigma, were also experienced by people born in Canada. We kicked off the project with a community forum at one of our arts locations. We wanted to have it in a neutral place and in a friendly place. And we were trying to figure out how to get over the whole stigma piece so that people would discuss things in conversation circles that we set up for that day. And so we brought in a theatre group from Kitchener-Waterloo that some people locally may have heard of, and it's called Empty Space. And they have a series of plays that they've developed based on interviews that they've done with refugees and immigrants about their experiences, either coming to Canada and, in this case, dealing with mental health or mental illness issues, and also dealing with our healthcare system. And so they started off with a series of vignettes, and what was interesting was for some of the immigrants who were part of the forum that who didn't necessarily speak English, or English wasn't their first language, they were laughing and also had tears in their eyes at the same time as people who understood English. So bringing theater really helped. It's a common language for people when it's done in a thoughtful way, and people could see themselves on stage, whether they were a service provider or someone who had immigration experience. We focused the forum on what their issues were. What did they see the project needed to address, and how? And when we asked for the top 5 things that they saw as being needs to help with mental health or substance use issues, it was interesting. You had the typical things in terms of support and that, but having opportunities to speak English, to integrate, and also to become employed and meaningfully employed were in the top 3, or in the top 5. So we did try, even though it wasn't the focus of the project, we did try to create opportunities for people to speak English, for people to be employed so they could add to their Canadian experience on their resumes. The other piece to the forum and to having conversation circles that were made up, that we made sure were mixed groups of service providers and refugees and immigrants, was that people got to learn from each other. And some of those barriers, including fear of making a fool of yourself, of saying the wrong thing, of not understanding, say, healthcare language, or not understanding some cultural pieces, that we could just see with the volume that grew in the room that people were getting over that and were quite eager to learn from each other. So on to the next slide, just talking about what the refugees and immigrants asked for as part of the engagement piece. I was actually surprised that one of the main things that they wanted was making sure that there was culturally appropriate printed and electronic materials, just talking about what mental illness is, what addictions is, about stigma, and making them inviting and also acceptable electronically. They wanted them printed so that they could take them back and digest them. They wanted them in several languages, and knowing that we sometimes had financial constraints with that, having them printed allowed them to take them back to their teacher or to their faith leader or somebody who could help them sort through the information if they forgot about what was explained to them when they received the materials. So we did focus on that as part of the project, and I'll get into that a little bit later. The other piece that they wanted, and I didn't include it in this slide, was that they wanted to continue with the conversation circles. We had them facilitated by a mental health or addiction professional or another service provider who works with refugees and immigrants, and a person with lived experience in terms of being a refugee and immigrant. And they really liked that style and wanted to learn more and in that format. And we decided in our plan that that would be much better as part of organizations that were already out there, and that we weren't going to supply that service ourselves on the long term, just because sustainability-wise, it didn't make sense. So moving on to the strategic plan, So the slide that you should be on at this point in time has 5 objectives, the target populations and strategic goals. So I've already talked, so the 5 objectives, I've already talked about the issue around stigma, and we know from the research and also the feedback we were getting just about the discrimination that people were dealing with. There are some cultures that don't have words for mental health or mental illness or addictions, or in their culture someone with someone with schizophrenia may be actually seen in a revered way and seen as someone who has special powers, and to be transferred to a country where that person would be hospitalized, it's a big jump for people to understand. And so the whole piece about knowledge and awareness and understanding where each other's coming from is really important to this project. Cultural sensitivity was definitely key, along with providing supportive environments with their own community, whether it's in their neighborhood or in their cultural community or their faith community, and also within agencies, providing a supportive environment for staff and for managers to try and create change that would support servicing refugees and immigrants in a more culturally sensitive way. And that also touches on the last point there under objectives. The target populations, as I mentioned before, initially the project wanted to just focus on refugees and immigrants and the mental health and addiction service providers. We learned at the very first forum that we were missing a big component of it, so that we needed to add another phase that focused on the English as a second language teachers, the faith leaders, and settlement workers. Those are the people that the refugees and immigrants had the most contact with, and are able to develop trusting relationships with. And because of they said even if they knew where the addiction and mental health services were, they probably wouldn't go to them until they were able to talk to somebody who had more knowledge and could encourage them and support them in terms of making that jump to going to a service and telling a stranger about their personal issues. And the last column is around strategic goals. So community engagement, as I said, was incorporated throughout the whole project. Resource development, training products. So we've developed a train the trainer specifically for that last group that I mentioned to you that we incorporated, the teachers, faith leaders, and settlement workers, along with the cultural piece for the addiction and mental health service providers. The evaluation plan, again, and a sustainability plan, all has been developed in consultation with refugees and immigrants and service providers. Moving on to the next slide, products, and we can move on to the next one then, Denisa. So the printed materials and electronic materials that the refugees and immigrants asked for were developed by service providers and refugees and immigrants. And because they didn't want anything labeled with addiction or mental illness or mental health, and yet we were also trying to overcome stigma, we called the pamphlet, "How Do You Feel Today?" And in small writing below, we have used the words addiction and mental health in there so that we could try and move things along a little bit in terms of people's comfort level. The pictures were selected by the refugees and immigrants who were part of our advisory committee on this. And it was interesting because after we finished it, some of the feedback that we received was that we should have included someone with a white face, because the group of refugees and immigrants were feeling that they were not being included with the faces that we had incorporated on the pamphlet. So that was a learning on our end, and we adjusted our next materials that we developed for the faith leaders and teachers and settlement workers to incorporate that. With the pamphlets, we found that we still could not give them out to refugees and immigrants, that people were not comfortable picking them up at a We tried it at a health fair, at a mosque, and there's just way too much stigma. And so we have distributed them through various service providers to share. And also we started to train mentees who have refugee or immigrant experience to make one-time presentations to various cultural groups or faith groups or groups that are already meeting, for an example, at our community health center, to talk about the content of the pamphlet and let people know that where the services are if they do need help or someone in the family needs help. The mentees were trained and paid to take the pamphlets out, and for some of them it was, I think, the first paid work that they had here, and the amount of positive feedback that we received from them, and just in terms of that experience, was a reward in itself. The next piece that we just finished developing and doing the training for is called How Can You Help? And this is for that third phase of a group that we added, the teachers, settlement workers, and faith leaders. And we incorporated an advisory committee this time and didn't use the conversation circles as much for these materials, and it was just the style of our coordinators that we had hired that we brought in that way of incorporating advice for our products. So moving on to the next page, which is the resources. The resources that we've developed are the pamphlets that I've shown you and the toolkit for faith leaders and to support immigrants and refugees, faith leaders, teachers, and settlement workers. And part of that toolkit is 5 training modules that are adaptable. They can be, each module can be an hour long, or it can be 10 minutes. We've incorporated topics that we were asked to incorporate, trying to fill a niche with some of the different cultural competency trainings that are already out there, and trying to offer information on a continuum, so from very simple to a little bit more complex in terms of its approach. So we've tried to incorporate that whole cultural competency piece and applying it to mental health and addiction, and then adding a very practical level of this is what you say to somebody, this is what you're looking for when you, or what you are looking for when you're observing someone's behavior. These are some questions that you can ask. This is some words that you can use, because all of those were barriers that were shared with us in the conversation circles. We have a social media presence, and that's outlined there with Facebook and Twitter, etc. And we've also offered Train the Trainer workshops related to these modules, 5 modules in the toolkit that we've developed. I already talked about the mentoring program, and we've also had volunteers from Western University who have helped us with some of the social media and also developing some of the planning and resources for the project. Moving on to the next slide. This is just some of the results that we've achieved at this point in time. So the workshop, the Train the Trainer that we have that we've done over the fall, for the series of Train the Trainers, we've actually trained over we've trained over 151 people, and the breakdown is beside the green bar. The breakdown in terms of who actually made up that 151 group of 151 is all laid out there. But I also want to mention that our mentees were also trained with the full Train the Trainer for the faith leaders and teachers and settlement workers. And they actually went out with the pamphlets, and they trained another 300 or more immigrants and refugees just about mental health, addiction, stigma, where to find help, and where to find support. So lastly, moving on to results and good practices. So some of these, so some of the things that we made sure we incorporated throughout the project has included making sure that we pay for ongoing contributions for immigrants and refugees, making sure that whatever we offer is in a good physical location, is accessible, and that meant that we not only had people come to us at events, but we also went out to them in their areas or to agencies where they may already be receiving services, and we would set up conversation circles where people were, maybe at a health center, and that was very much appreciated both by the service providers and the refugees and immigrants. And same thing with time. We offered conversation circles and times for individual interviews throughout the day and evening, trying to engage as many people as possible, and especially those people who may have more barriers than others. We always offered paid transportation and childcare, and I will say, despite that, we hardly had anybody use the taxi chip, and with the childcare, we never had anybody use it. But I will say that it was they're very good to offer, especially helping people realize that we really want them to attend, and we're trying to do everything possible to create the scenario that they could attend conversation circles. We also offered interpretation when possible. Many people felt more comfortable bringing their own service provider or a family member to do interpretation. The one flag I have with that is if we're using medical terminology or things like that, that if the interpreter doesn't have that background or doesn't have those words, things can get misunderstood. We made sure we had sustainable engagement throughout the project, but we found when there were gaps in funding that we were not able to, when there was gaps in funding, when we went back to the re-engagement piece, it took a long time, and also we found that a lot of refugees and immigrants have changed their information, so we couldn't reach them. And same thing with service providers. There can be a fairly big turnover for people who, even just within a year and a half. So that was a learning part for us, that we needed to incorporate extra time for that. And the first two coordinators we had for the project recommended to us that we really try to hire somebody with refugee or immigrant experience. And we always were open-minded and inclusive in terms of how we advertise the jobs and our interview process and all the rest. Unfortunately, this most current phase of the project, we were able to find two coordinators who did have refugee and immigrant background, and also a whole breadth of skills that we were looking for. Because the coordinators had to be kind of a jack of all trades at times, it can be difficult to find people who have everything. So we've been very fortunate that we've had 4 great coordinators. The last part, the next slide, just around the seeds of change and how it relates to the recovery-oriented practice. The guidelines that I focused on for these next few slides are from page 62 and 63 of the guidelines, and focused on the needs of immigrants, refugees, ethnocultural and racialized communities. So I've taken a few things out to highlight how our project has dovetailed with that. So the first part is around personal reflection and how our identity actually affects our relationships. And in our forums that we offered, in our conversation circles and in our training, we always had a self-reflection exercise, one being some of you may have seen it before, but a power flower, and where each petal represented a piece of a person's identity, whether it's their face or age, gender, and they would write in their description of themselves, the most predominant way they saw themselves, and then within that petal would write down what they saw as being what description had the power in our society. So if my first language is English, in our society here in Ontario, most of Ontario anyway, English would be where people would have power. So they filled out all the petals and then colored in the ones where they had more power. And it was eye-opening to a lot of people just about how they may be seen, even though they may not see themselves as having some privilege. It was also important to us that we continually heard each other's perspectives, and that, as I mentioned before, is all part of the conversation circles, the advisory committee, and the resource, How Can You Help? On to the next slide about knowledge. Understanding responsiveness. The conversations helped with that because there's barriers to, we can't build a field, that Field of Dreams movie where you build a field and people will come to play baseball. That doesn't work. You need to develop trust. You need to develop some engagement practices that bring people together, and their conversation circles were one way of doing that. Social determinants of health were considered throughout the projects, and I mentioned them, such as things as transportation, childcare, and trauma, again, what has been incorporated throughout the project. The cultural differences, that's what our resources are focused on, is with how do you feel and how can you help. And throughout the project, again, we are mindful of barriers for access, discrimination, and racism. And I always said to people, we'll always make mistakes, whether they're, and we recognize they're not intentional. We have to recognize that we need to keep trying and keep the dialogue open, and we incorporated that throughout the project. The next slide around skills and behaviors. Compassion was throughout from everybody, from the advisory committee, the steering committee, the coordinators, and when we brought people together, you could definitely feel that throughout the room. The following points are also fairly obvious, I think, in terms of understanding mental health and illness, trauma, how you get support for recovery, using interpreters, cultural brokers, settlement workers, and faith leaders. We didn't use cultural brokers that much, and part of that was access. And there were some other issues with that in terms of cultural brokers sometimes not understanding the culture of another part of their country and things like that. But it is something that is needed, so always keep that in your mind when you're doing your planning. With all our resources, we have let people know where they can find appropriate services. We've always made sure that the written information is simple to read, and that's an exercise in itself in terms of writing. And we have always tried to remember that the person that we're dealing with has a community or a family around them, and so this whole project is looking at not only the person, but also people as a whole. So the last slide has the Seeds of Change materials link to it. It's on the NIC website, and I will let you know we are a low-cost, no-cost organization, so it's a fairly simple website, but there's, under the Seeds of Change tab, there are 2 places that you can get the resources. The first tab for refugees and immigrants, or subheading, I guess, and then the next subheading is the train the trainer information and background information for the faith leaders, settlement workers, and teachers. And the cultural competency piece can also be used, those modules can be used for a wide variety of services or service providers. So I think that's it for right now. Thank you. And thanks, Benita.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Janet and Rob. We have had sort of a steady stream of questions coming in. So if you're both available, I'll start to put some of these questions for you, or to you. And I think the first one I have here is for you, Rob. And the question is, what is the, quote, active ingredient of religion or God or spirituality for immigrants in your research? How does spirituality facilitate recovery?
Yeah, excellent question. I think there's two aspects, and I'll talk more about religion than spirituality, because in terms of religion, there's a theological aspect and there's a practical aspect. So in terms of the theological aspect, being religious gives people a framework in which to understand human suffering as part of the inevitable consequence of the human experience, that suffering generally will pass. We just celebrated Easter and Passover, and I think the key messages from in the Christian narrative and the Jewish narrative, two religions I'm most familiar with, are that there will be suffering in life, but that with the grace of God and the help of God, and by working in communion with God as a human, that you can overcome suffering, and there's hope. And hope is a word that's throughout sacred scriptures in every religion, I think. So that theological aspect can really help carry somebody through a difficult time. And then if you're an atheist or someone who doesn't have that, if you think the universe is just random, if a human is just evolved in this random collection of neutrons or whatever, maybe you don't have that same framework. And a practical aspect. So the practical aspect is that if you're a member of a church community, or you attend a synagogue and you're friendly with a priest or a rabbi or an imam or whatever, that people will visit you. So like in our study, people said, well, the minister from the church comes around once a week. He sends some of the youth workers to check up on me. At Christmas, they gave me a hamper, which I was able to redistribute as presents to my family and friends. It gives some structure to the day, praying in the morning, praying in the evening. So you've got that instrumental, practical, emotional support from fellow congregants and ministers in a religious community, but then you have that theological framework which can help frame your experience and put some meaning on it. So I think those are the two key factors.
Perfect, Rob. And the follow-up question to that was, do you have any further research planned on this topic in particular of the interconnection between recovery and faith?
I've been doing research on this issue since 2003. So definitely, I imagine the rest of my academic life, this is an area that I'm exploring. There's actually, this is a good time, maybe a bit of self-interest and promotion. I'm applying for some grant money in the deadline's the end of August or end of September, where I sent out a paper to all the participants that I wrote a couple of years ago called Religious Competence as Cultural Competence, where I give recommendations about how to incorporate religion and spirituality into kind of everyday mental health care. And I'm actually kind of going to apply for a grant to try and train clinicians in various places how to incorporate this. So if anyone on the line is interested in being a research side or helping me recruit participants or being a partner in the research, you can feel free to email me. So I do have plans, but my current grant's not really focused on religion, so I need to get a new grant, and that's my next step.
Perfect, thank you. The next question is for you, Janet. It's sort of from the perspective that you were talking about seeds of change, it sounds very much like it's primarily focused on adults. Do you or did Seeds of Change do any work that was specific to youth or young newcomers to Canada?
Yes, we had youth come out to some of the sessions. There weren't a lot, though. We did try to get a higher number than what we did, but those who came out gave us some really good suggestions. There were some barriers. We just had youth from 16 up invited to it, and part of it was just around some feedback that we had from immigrant and refugee parents about some logistics and barriers and things like that. And for where our project was in our capacity, we felt it was better to primarily look at 16 and up. And to be honest with you, we had the best luck with 18, like going into university or college age to 22, 23. And so we incorporated their suggestions with this, and we've kept a relationship with the university so that what we've developed here, they can actually incorporate with some of their student projects that they already have on the go. But some of the components, some of the modules have already been used for trainings up at the university.
Fantastic. Rob, I've got a couple more questions here for you. And I think one of them is you've primarily talked about immigrants. Does your research or has your research included refugee populations, or are you primarily looking at individuals who come to Canada sort of as an economic immigrant?
Yeah, great question. I should have made that clear right from the beginning that my studies are mostly on immigrants who have come here either as economic migrants or as family member reunification programs, or through those other avenues. Some of my studies have included refugees, but they're not. I wouldn't extrapolate what I said today to specific refugee populations, because there's been other researchers who specialize in those refugee populations, Syrian refugees, for example, who have had much more traumatic pre-migration experience. So yeah, in the studies I talked about, and the ones I linked to, it's mostly migrants, but they're not necessarily like economic. I wouldn't say economic migrants as in that they're doctors and lawyers and accountants, etc. Some have come through other avenues to get into Canada, which are not refugees in the legal sense of the term, but people who may have come from Jamaica on a student visa and certainly don't have a lot of money and a lot of opportunities, and they've just got permanent residence kind of that way, and kind of stuck in Canada in a way, one could say.
Perfect. And just as a follow-up to that, Rob, for folks who are looking for more research specific to refugee mental health, are there researchers that you're familiar with? Would you point folks into a specific direction there?
Yep. I've got two colleagues at McGill who do a lot of work with refugee mental health. One of them is called Lawrence Kermeyer. I'll write his name in the text box, and the other one is called Cecilia Rousseau, who does a lot of child mental health. Yeah, so I would say my expertise is more in kind of immigrants as a general category, and refugees are a specific subcategory, and their expertise is really specific to those groups.
Perfect, thank you. And I think this question is really maybe directed to both of you. But how can we work with local communities who receive immigrants and refugees to be more inclusive and culturally sensitive? From either of your experiences, are there any practices, programs, or media strategies that help to create more inclusive and welcoming communities?
Honestly, I've found that meeting people in person has had the biggest impact. There's lots of other ways in terms of whether you're going through electronic or through print media, but through media. And also just having people go out and speak at some of the smaller circles, such as with the different faith communities, or at schools, parent-teacher nights, things like that. It does help.
I would say it's a two-way street, that both the immigrants, speaking as an immigrant myself personally as well, that when I moved to Quebec, my French wasn't very good, but I've made an effort to try and learn, and I've done various things. And likewise, I think what Janet just said, I agree. In person, hosting people, organizing events, Canada Day, St. Jean-Baptiste Day, things like this, having panels, discussions, bringing people in. When I teach immigrant mental health at McGill, I'll invite an immigrant who had mental health problems to come and co-present with me and talk about their life and the community and the problems they faced, etc. But as I said, I think it's a two-way street.
Perfect, thank you. Go ahead, Janet.
Oh, and the other piece that sometimes is useful when there is outreach like that is doing kind of a role reversal. So an example is there's a video that I use for some work we're doing around language interpretation, and in that video, the woman has a baby who's quite sick, and she speaks English, but she's in a hospital where no one does, and it has a whole different effect on an English-speaking audience than if I showed a video of a woman who does not speak English, is in an English hospital. There's just a huge difference in terms of relating to that person. So the role reversal sometimes can help.
That's so interesting. I think so often we always carry our own individual perspectives, and it's hard to step out of our own shoes and have compassion and empathy for individuals when we don't understand what it might be like from their perspective. So I think I love to hear that you're incorporating those kinds of videos, Janet. I have another question here, and it's for Rob, but I'm wondering, Janet, if you may also have something to add here. And it's more around a changing organizational culture. So it says, how can we change our organization's practice regarding cultural competence of our mental health practitioners? They sort of have an add-on here saying, often if it comes from the top, you see better results. And Rob, you sort of said, the concept of recovery has been embraced at a national level by a number of countries, by provinces, and we're starting to see it catch on. But this is more around, how do we create change if we don't necessarily have buy-in at all levels?
Yeah, great question. So there's a whole subfield of psychiatry called implementation science, or the implementation, and I still do quite a bit of work in that field, and so there's actually that's an evidence-based, that's a question that can be answered through evidence. What we find is a combination of two factors can be really important. One is kind of strong charismatic leadership. So it really helps if someone senior in the organization, CEO or COO or chief clinician, will recognize that there's a need and will take active steps to implement services which meet that need. And what also helps if these two are working in parallel is to have kind of grassroots support, so people in the community pushing. A lot of health service providers have committees, regular consultations with the community, with patients, with staff, and that people push this as a need. I was involved in evaluation of kind of 50 sites in the United States, evaluating how they implemented practices, kind of new practices, and changed. And one other thing we found really important is evidence, that if there's somebody in the community and people on this line on the call, clinicians or people who are like halfway up the food chain or down the food chain, can say, look, there's evidence that this works, it's helping people recover, it's being implemented at X amount of other sites, we should integrate it here. We find that people from the top to the bottom will say, that's a really good idea, like, let's start doing this. So I think combination of kind of charismatic leadership from the top, grassroots action from the bottom, and somebody, a kind of agent of change, pushing the evidence side, saying this is not someone's opinion, it's not a whim, that there's been X amount of systematic studies which show that if we implement this practice, it's going to actually help people in their recovery, and that those three factors seem to be important. I'll send a link in the text box to some of the implementation papers.
There's a couple things I'd add to that too. Is chair of a local board here that we were incorporating health equity into our planning, and so it was top down and bottom up in terms of it, but I think it's important to include your board also in terms of the change. And not to sound crass, but lawsuits can also help drive things fairly quickly, and when you look at the legalities about why we should be more inclusive in terms of our services, that can be a possibility. But so risk management, coming from an approach of risk management, I think also can help. It can carry some weight.
Perfect. Thank you both. I would also add to that, for those of you who are interested in learning more about cultural competence training, the Case for Diversity has a sort of a summary of evidence on cultural competence training, looking at reviews of reviews. I think probably similar to what Rob was talking about. So if you're looking for more information about the effectiveness, you can find some of it in that research. I think at this time, we are done for questions. I would like very much to thank our two presenters, Rob and Janet, for sharing with us your insights, your research, your experiences, and I think for engaging with us. Rob, I've seen you on the chat function sharing out extra things, and Janet, I think you've been really sort of authentic in your sharing about what your lessons learned were, what can sort of be shared with others, and the great resources that you guys have on the NIC website. So thank you both so much for joining us, and for the folks on the phone, we want to thank you all. We do continue our monthly recovery-oriented practice webinars. So our next webinar will be on Thursday, June 1st from 1 to 2:30 p.m., and it will actually be part of a French webinar series that we are offering. On June 7th, we will have our next English webinar, and that will be looking at individualized service, delivery. So it's working with researchers out of Boston who are going to come and talk to us about their funding and how to fund individualized services. And so finally, we'd ask that each of you, as you exit the webinar today, an evaluation form will pop up, and so we'd please ask you to fill out the survey that opens after you leave. From your responses, we're actually able to improve our webinar delivery and also identify new and interesting topics for you all. And so with that, I would like to thank you all for joining us. I'd like to thank my two colleagues who are in the room with me, Laura Mullally and Jamie. Rob and Janet, thank you again for all of your help and for all of your insight onto this topic. And I think with that, we will leave everybody for the afternoon. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Monita. Thanks, Laura.